Hello, my name is Jay Wilson, Resilience Coordinator in Clackamas County. I'm very happy to be able to share the findings, results, observations from our trip, and I'll be representing emergency response and recovery as part of the Earthquake Resilience Program today. I've got a few objectives that I looked at as an emergency manager in making the trip over there in the reconnaissance, looking at the emergency countermeasures as an operational way of stabilizing and protecting critical and historical features in the communities, interested in the displacement of populations from their communities and the impact that has at a societal and an economic level, the transition from shelter to temporary housing and the expectation for long-term housing recovery, how these displacements affect economic impacts or create those impacts when you displace an employment base. Especially for me, the historical and cultural preservation issues that came up with these very vulnerable structures and the meaning that they represent for community identity and the challenges for protecting them. And then lastly, this transition into recovery and reconstruction. What would that look like for this particular event based on the kind of things we saw from the 2009 event in LAquila? At the onset of our trip, on the very first day, we had the privilege of meeting with Alfio Moretti, who manages the earthquake program in the Umbria region. He gave us 2 hours of his time to share his insights and to give us kind of a framework on what to look for. And especially for me as an emergency official, a non-engineer, it was very helpful to hear, at that time, a very quick translation by Sylvia, but just some basic understanding of the priorities they had in looking at recovery, and especially around the values of the community that are really what sets the basis for how to recover and what to rebuild. The facility they had was base isolated. I think it was built after the '97 earthquake, and they said it performed quite well during this sequence. This is just a quick mosaic of images to convey the logistical complexities of navigating through a region that's been impacted by a sequence of earthquakes. The top two images show the kind of checkpoints that had to be navigated through, especially when roads were closed and access was limited. And we had to have clearances that were all negotiated by our local partners. The signage, especially representing Akuma, for example, that was a closed town and there was no access in it if you didn't have predefined passes. And then just the bottom two showing the red zones that almost every one of the communities we visited had either total or some level of closure in the Zona Rosa that had restricted access, and basically there was no one living beyond those areas in most situations. I was so impressed with this group that's within the fire agency, the Fire Protection Services of engineers who come in and quickly, clear and provide access, but also have these very improvised countermeasures that were amazing to behold in their scale and their complexity to stabilize both the critical facilities, but also a lot of the historical heritage buildings in these communities so they wouldn't be lost through the aftershock sequences. And I've got a short video explaining a little bit more in detail of that.
These are the countermeasures to avoid to open the Reed Street and avoid the collapse of the wall. And at university, one of the laboratory of ReLuis at the University of Napoli, we test a masonry wall like this on a shaking table. We have also a movie that we can on our website testing the effectiveness of this countermeasure.
And how fast does it take, or how long to install this?
This is a fire safety man are in charge of installing this countermeasure. Is one like this is quite fast, but most important problem is that they have to find a good anchorage system,
right.
A good anchorage where anchors the roads.
Mm-hmm.
So the anchorage may happen both on the ground or on the safe portion of the buildings.
And other videos that I had collected, but I don't have represented here, but are very vital, are the emergency countermeasures as part of the post-earthquake building inspection process. And I just have to emphasize the necessity for having a system and a process in place ahead of time so that pre-identified inspectors who are trained and certified are able to get in and quickly assess the buildings and have the follow-ups necessary during aftershock sequences in order to quickly evaluate and have these buildings repaired and reopened for recovery. We saw a lot of the folks who were there with us at the time were from the university systems and professors and graduate students who did a lot of this work there, and it was quite impressive. This is a quick rundown slide that I've used in a number of my presentations just for the sake of scale and overview. The 4 regions that we visited at the time there, about 130 communities that I had heard in my travels that had significant damage, but with 50 of those that had almost complete evacuations, and that at the peak of that time it was about 32,000 people. We visited Viso, Usita, Castel Sant'Angelo, Norcia, Preci, Cascia, Accumuli, Arquata, Ona, and L'Aquila in this week's time, with the last 2 being on our day returning to Rome. And then this last set of bullets is just outlining these 2 stages of building inspections. There's a detailed one that had just over 74,000 buildings, and then the one that has the acronym FAST is a preliminary inspection, but it's done much more quickly and with less level of detail at almost 105,000. And I would say these are also building inspections, but not the number of inspections. These were the buildings that had been inspected. So there's many more times of these inspections, I believe, for the sake of the aftershock sequence that required multiple inspections. One of the areas that I was particularly interested in were the number of people that were displaced, and this was the best representation I could find from the Civil Protection Department, showing this timeline of the number of people who required assistance, primarily living assistance or sheltering or housing, in the sequence, from the far left being about 5,000 after the first shock in August, and then that number went down as these people were assisted, and then late October, almost 1 year ago, almost this highest number of about nearly 32,000 people who needed assistance and some type of shelter and housing. And then by the beginning of the year, they had gotten that down to nearly 10,000 people still needing assistance. And then the aftershock sequence that culminated in mid-January brought that back up to 15,000. And so this is the closest date that's online right now this is, let's see, of August of 2017, showing that about 7,500 people are still requiring assistance. This is the nature of the communities that we visited, Accumuli being possibly the hardest hit that we visited, and many of the engineers were interested in seeing it a second time after they were there in September, and how this community had been through the full duration of the sequence for those number of months. And I've got a short video statement that I made standing in Accumuli, discussing the impressions I had while I was there in first person. Standing here in the middle of Accumuli, it was initially damaged in September, but then the aftershocks and larger sequence in October is what leveled this town. They've got temporary homes they're building maybe a quarter mile or half mile down the slope from here as a way of housing the several hundred people that live here, and that's a temporary fix to allow them to remain in the area as they ultimately rebuild this town and remain on the site. I mean, the whole point is they want to remain here where their homes are, where their lives are, where their history and culture is. The Civil Protection Authority, Mr. Moretti, that we met with at the beginning of the week, said they have to work on the needs, from the position of the needs of the people first, and that so many of the people who live up in these places are older, that the children who've grown up and left don't have the historical appreciation for the culture that's tied to the history here. And so they have to work from the position of the older people who will remain and who will come back and who define the values of the community. And that's the position that they're working from. It's their lives that they're building and reconstructing for, not the young folks who've left and who didn't choose to remain, and who may not place the same level of value on the history and the authenticity of these old towns. It's why behind me you can see this old tower, bell tower from this church. It's been completely encased in protection by the fire protection professionals who come into these towns and do these countermeasures to save these old structures. Because once it's gone, it's lost and has to be rebuilt newly. And so the emphasis on protecting the history is really huge here for Italy. And the conflict is really the architectural and historical preservation of these structures that are hundreds of years old but are very seismically weak, and the seismic safety provisions for protection, but not to compromise the historical nature and character of these areas. And so in that short segment I was mentioning, outside of Akuma, just barely down the hill, there was this area where they were building the temporary housing. There were several in construction at the time that we were there, and the whole point is to have them nearby the original site of the town, for the sake of the proximity of the people in the land that they've lived in for generations, and the continued connectivity with their neighbors, and their sense of identity that they have in this period while their town is being reconstructed. In the top portion, Arquata, we were there listening to the details about the work going into getting this area ready, and they were expecting that this area particularly to open in September, about a year after the initial quake sequence began. We were lucky in Norcia, just outside of the old town, that this housing area, this temporary housing settlement, had just opened before our trip got there. So when we were walking through, this very generous woman, Isabel, had stepped out and given us a short interview to discuss her situation. And she lived in an residential area just right outside of the old town. She said she and her husband had to live in their car for a few weeks before they could be relocated to the coast, where some of the resort areas were empty during the non-tourist season, and they stayed there for a number of months before they got relocated. And they had a 2-hour commute each way each day, so she was very much relieved to be here, closer to where she lived and worked. And she didn't have any grievances about how long this had taken. She seemed to have an appreciation of the complexity of doing this type of work. And when we asked, how long do you expect to be here before you can move back into your neighborhood? And she said probably 6 or 7 years. And I was impressed that her expectations were set like that, because that seems pretty realistic. And she's got a pretty firm grounding of how long this type of transition actually takes. We also were very interested in looking at the economic impacts from the disruption of the services, from not being able to operate from their original locations, but also from the employee base and the level of connectivity to supply chains, for example. Just outside of Viso, there was a little food cart that was just out front of the deli that was had the business, which was closed because the building was under construction or work for repairs. And this bank that had moved into a little storage container type unit, a prefab, in order to operate outside of their building. In Norcia, we were very lucky to meet this prosciutto business, and the gentleman, the proprietor there, was very gracious in sharing some of his samples. And when I asked Sylvia about translating, he asked him about his situation. He said his wife and daughter had moved outside of the area, the earthquake area, for several months now, and that he lived alone in one of the two homes they had, but both were severely damaged, and he was still living in one room of a partially damaged house, and coming to work every day in order to manage the cured meats that had to be maintained, or he would lose all of his inventory. So he's stayed behind in order to keep his business afloat, basically. But another area that I was paying attention to there was the Agriturismo, this tourism in the agricultural sector. You can see the signs on the right hand showing kind of the variety of locations that have this kind of immersive experience for people to travel in these almost like B&Bs on the farm. And people take weekends or regular vacations to have this immersive experience. But the farmers were hit just like the old towns, and many of them were living in little pop-up trailers in order to stay on the premises and take care of their livestock or their agriculture, and had makeshift or temporary shelters like the one in the left-hand side that were provided by the government to help them stay there, or they would have probably gone out of business too. The historical preservation just had so many complex aspects to it. I can't really cover them in any detail here, but you can see a number of these images of the frescoes on the dome of this old chapel that are probably only being held together by that seismic tie that runs through the middle, this wall that had collapsed and was under construction, and these architectural features that we saw in a lot of these places on pallets that were being collected and protected to be reused at some point. The emphasis on that, the authenticity of the original materials is a huge one there for the sake of the identity and the historical legacy. We had a brief meeting with one of the monks of Norcia, Father Martino, who told us so many stories about the relationship they have had before and during and after the earthquake with the people in the town of Norcia, and how welcome they were there in providing support during and afterwards, and the work they're doing now on the recovery and helping the town, through their own kind of business work in their brewery and bringing people in. And I provided him as a gift of appreciation one of our beers from Deschutes in Oregon. He was very impressed and happy with that. Here's a quick video from Professor Liberatore. Here we are in the square of Norcia, and there are so many issues about saving the historical culture that's so representative and important to this city. How do you balance seismic safety and cultural history?
Yeah, this is a very crucial point, because cultural heritage is typically very vulnerable to seismic action. So the challenge is to save it as at the best we can do it, but at the same time to save the cultural heritage. So we have to carry out light intervention in order not to lose what the cultural heritage is. For instance, we typically prefer intervention based on tie rods, typically on steel elements which do not impact strongly on cultural heritage.
And as our trip wound up, we had made sure to have time to look at this recovery perspective from the communities that had been hit from the 2009 event. This was a community just outside of LAquila called Ona, and immediately you could see in the town the memorial in the top center for the folks, the victims who had died during the earthquake. They're very much commemorated there in this scene. The name of the the street sign for the victims of April 6th. And the town center, the community centers, had a number of different signs to really reinforce the purpose and the identity and the spirit of the community's resilience to stay there and to come back. It was very evident when you toured around, this juxtaposition between the old and the new, and how the old town was remembered in the photographs around the construction site, and then it had been set aside almost kind of like a museum that was now overgrown after 8 years, as the construction was still well underway. But the very rich appreciation of the community's history and the sense of identity that was there. And then going into LAquila, this is in the main piazza, the town center. The nickname that I was told, the City of Cranes, was very evident that construction was still heavily underway, and it seemed, still quite a time in the distance before it would be fully reopened again. A few shops were open behind the scaffolding, but there was construction everywhere you looked that was going on. We took a moment to stop at one of the multifamily housing units that had been kind of pushed to open quickly to demonstrate at the time a very strong sense of accomplishment and purpose after the earthquake, and to resettle people. And it's fairly controversial, I was told, because of displacing people from their original neighborhoods and being resettled maybe without any connection to their neighbors or their sense of place. And these buildings were quickly erected with base isolation, but I was told at the time that there weren't enough base isolators available, so the buildings were built, and a lot of time there were spacers put in, and the isolators were then installed afterwards. One of the most touching stories there was this couple we kind of serendipitously met when we were walking around, and they lived in one of those multifamily units, but they came back every day to the home where they originally were from that they couldn't live in. But they had a garden, and they had their chickens, and they came there every day to basically tend to their needs on their old land. But the husband, I think, was suffering from some form of dementia, I believe, and this is where he felt at home, and he knew his way around, and he didn't have a sense of where he was at the other locations. So there was this adaptability that they had made in order to have a place to stay overnight, but to come back to every day. It was impressive of how they navigated that. Lastly, closing, I have a few final words around this issue around housing and housing retrofitting from Professor Massi.
We have already made a lot of work on public buildings, schools and hospitals. Now we are dealing with residential buildings, because the effects of the past earthquakes, such as LAquila earthquake, Emilia earthquake, and also the last earthquake in central Italy, that the fatalities from earthquakes are mainly due to the collapse of residential buildings and not public buildings.
And then here a piece about retrofitting.
And to this end, we are studying also seismic, some retrofitting techniques that can be applied working only outside the building, so the people can stand in the building during the work. This is a question of sustainability of this. Frequently we have also money to make the intervention, but people don't want to go out of their homes, so if we are able to propose them interventions that are integrated and with an attention also with the exigence of disabled people, and are able to take into their homes the people. This is the future of our seismic mitigation programs.
And so, coming from that, these conclusions, there's a thread that goes through all of these points, that this whole sense of identity and belonging and sense of place are really strong factors that have to be applied in the recovery process of how people are connected to where they live. And this issue around mass displacement, just like the issues with residential housing and all these communities where people had to leave while all of this work is going on, it does have a direct impact to the welfare of the social and the economic aspects of these communities. And that something I came away with about defining resilience is that it really has to come from the way it's defined at the regional and local levels and the norms, the practices there. That building with stone as opposed to wood, because you're using the inherent resources that are available. And so the type of approaches that they have, the countermeasures that they were demonstrating, are very much those that are endemic to the area, and that's what they are working with. So in concluding, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these findings.